All right, I know this background is pretty distracting, but it's also kind of cool, so I'll try and talk. While you see what's going on here behind us is an example of macroevolution, or really the formation of species and the diversity of different species in the living things which we see around us. And so when we're talking about macroevolution, we're talking about higher order evolution, groups of species. We're talking about taxonomy. We're talking about the fossil record and how we can see different life forms and their evolution throughout time. Microevolution was just looking at populations, which is our basic definition of evolution. But if you have enough of these microevolution processes, and that should lead to these macroevolution events. So to review, or to kind of start with that, we're going to talk about species and definitions of species. All right, first, again, microevolution is looking at populations. We're looking at changes in traits and how they can be seen over even a course of a few generations. Macroevolution, though, we're looking at species or larger groups, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and it's looking at the divergence of these groups, when they happen, what are their relationships, and requires many generations to accumulate those differences enough to be different species. Well, what is a species? This is a question that has many theories, and even given to you, you may probably have some ideas about what a species is. Well, there are different concepts for how we define species, and we'll go through these four: biological, morphological, ecological, and phylogenetic separately. So first, the biological species concept was proposed by a prominent biologist and ecologist, Ernst Mayr, in 1942, and his definition is that they are defined by their ability to reproduce. So species are populations that interbreed naturally and produce viable offspring. Therefore, isolated species that do not reproduce become different species as they are in different environments. So on the flip side, you could say if two populations are not breeding, two animals that may be closely related but do not breed in nature, then they would be considered separate species. So gene flow, if you have two separate populations and you have individuals moving between them, then that's going to prevent speciation because you have genes being shared. But if gene flow is stopped, then you're going to have different accumulation of traits, which should eventually lead to reproductive isolation. So this little cartoon up at the top shows it's a minotaur and a mermaid, and they are not letting this biological species concept get in the way of their love. But what will the children look like? We don't know. Okay, this is, I can't remember why I put this on here. It's like a minotaur. Maybe that's what their baby would look like. Oh yeah. Half mermaid, half minotaur. Beautiful. All right. So reproductive isolation can occur through either prezygotic or postzygotic barriers. The prezygotic barriers are going to not even allow for sperm and egg to come in contact with each other to form a zygote. Postzygotic barriers then are looking at after a zygote and a young is able to be reproduced, that zygote is somehow incompatible with its environment and cannot produce offspring. So prezygotic barriers include habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral, mechanical, and gametic isolation. We'll talk about these individually first. Habitat isolation. Well, if species inhabit two different areas, then they aren't going to come in contact with each other. Oftentimes, this can occur in one ecosystem. Let's say you have a snake that prefers the water and another snake that prefers the trees, well, they are going to be isolated by their habitat. An example here is you've got 3 species of bears in the same genus: brown bears, grizzly bears, polar bears, and black bears. Well, black bears and brown bears live in the same forests, but they have different ecological requirements and thus will inhabit different parts. The polar bear, of course, lives in the Arctic and is much more suited to that environment where the brown bear is not. But interesting enough, sometimes you will get polar bear, brown bear hybrids in those zones where they come in close contact with each other. Temporal isolation, species that mate during different times of the day, season, or year. So here we have eastern and western spotted skunk. There is an area where they will coexist, but their mating seasons are different. And therefore, if there's a female of one species and a male of another species are in the same area, they will be ready to mate at different times, and so they won't mate. Behavioral isolation. The best example of this is a bunch of lacewings. These are a type of insect. You've probably seen them in the grass. Different species all live in the same area, but the ones that are the same species will respond to a specific mating call produced by the lacewings, and only to those specific mating calls. So you see 3 different mating or sound patterns here. These belong to 3 different species, and that way they can isolate themselves and who they mate with. Other behaviors, maybe mating dances or different calls like these guys. Anything that has to do with behaviors that would get them in close contact for reproduction. Mechanical isolation. Okay, so there are some morphological differences that would prevent successful mating. This picture to the left is not real. That is not a giraffe trying to mount a donkey. It is, it's a real picture, but it's just an optical illusion. It looks like it's trying to mount the donkey, but it's actually just falling over in proximity to the donkey or whatever. But you could imagine that there would be some problems if this was trying to occur. A male giraffe would have a hard time mating with a female donkey. So a more concrete example is in snails. If the shell turns in a specific way, if another snail has a shell that turns in the opposite direction, so clockwise and counterclockwise, it prevents the reproductive parts from being able to line up to exchange sperm and egg, or sperm. And so this creates a mechanical isolation that these individuals can't reproduce. All right, gamete isolation. So this is where everything else is aligned, but for some reason the sperm and the egg are incompatible. So this is especially important for broadcast spawning. So on the left here, you have a bunch of corals. The way that they reproduce is they just send their sperm and eggs out into the ocean, and then they just mix together. Well, a lot of organisms are doing this, including we have red and purple sea urchins. They'll just release their sperm and eggs into the ocean. Well, there is some sort of chemical mechanism for recognition, and so the red sea urchins do not hybridize with the purple sea urchins and vice versa, and or anything else that has eggs and sperm floating around in the ocean. So the gametes are not compatible. All right, postzygotic barriers. So this is where mating has occurred. Generally, reproduction is successful, but there's something wrong with the progeny. So we can have reduced hybrid viability where the hybrid is weak, okay, and it impairs the survival. So it's not going to do well in the environment. It's not going to be able to be a new species. So you can see that with these grasses here. You have the two parents, which are different species. They can hybridize, but they produce a really weak, non-competitive hybrid. So that's not going to allow for speciation to occur. Reduced hybrid fertility, so you can see that with donkeys and horses. You can mate them and create a mule. The mule is very viable in its environment, but it's sterile, so it can't reproduce afterwards. And then we have hybrid breakdown, similar to hybrid viability, where they can produce offspring, but the offspring are feeble or sterile. Okay, and more generations. This generally occurs over more than just one generation. So the first generation might be adequate enough to survive, but then it reproduces, and the next generation is even more feeble and more as it continues to reproduce, and generally will be selected against. All right, so there are some limitations to the biological species concept, and that is it's only relevant to those that reproduce sexually. And there are a lot of organisms that don't, such as this bacteria. We in Bio 1 talked about binary fission, and we talked about a bunch of other asexual reproductive forms earlier in the course, and so it doesn't apply to them. Some species also do produce fertile hybrids in intermediate zones. I have a couple examples here of the golden fronted redstart and the spectacled redstart, and there is an area where they geographically overlap in Ecuador, and they create these hybrids, which are viable. So do you have two species or not? Again, brown bears and polar bears will create what's called a growler bear. That's what you see here. Does that mean they are separate species? Or they are the same species, just with slightly different populations? So it leaves some things unanswered. So we can look at other things. The morphological species concept is really just looking at the morphological differences between organisms and populations. And you can use those and accumulate those to describe then one species over another. This is originally how species were described. However, it is somewhat subjective. What do you use? What are the characters, and how many differences require a species designation? The ecological species concept, we mentioned this kind of before, how two populations can be ecologically separated. Well, we can also use this to define their species. So if one organism is using the resources in the environment different than another, we can say, all right, well, they are separated ecologically. And that would be grounds for separating then our polar bear and brown bear. It also takes into account natural selection, which can be used for both asexual or sexual species. All right, the phylogenetic species concept is that the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor are a species. And generally, we determine these relationships using morphology or molecular sequences or similarities such as DNA, RNA, and proteins. And then we can parse out relationships by building what's called a phylogeny, which we will talk more about later. But this also seems somewhat arbitrary. How many differences constitute a species? How many common ancestors, or how far back does a common ancestor have to be to be considered a species? But those are the different species concepts, and the information behind it. We will discuss these in class Wednesday.